Well, good morning. It's Crazy Cheap Chick, and I recently took my little grandson down to the Little House on the Prairie Museum. It's near Independence, Kansas, but it's out in the middle of nowhere. And the Ingalls family, they were in Kansas in 1869 and 1870, which would have made Laura really young because she was born February 7th, 1867. So she would have been about 3 when they came here. And her sister Carrie was born there, though. Carrie was born August 3rd, 1870. And they know that she was born at the Little House on the Prairie site. And so how long they were there after Carrie was born, I don't know. But they couldn't have been there more than, a little over a year. And Laura was really, really young. But there's something to me about standing in a place where someone famous stood and seeing the exact same view that they saw that is kind of fascinating to me. Even though it's 100 years apart, I just think it's really cool to see the exact location of where Laura Ingalls' family lived that she wrote about. And she wrote really well, and I really liked one of the descriptions that she gave of Kansas. I'm just going to read this quote from the Little House on the Prairie book. She liked the enormous sky and the winds and the land that you couldn't see to the end of. Everything was so free and big and splendid. And that's still Kansas today. That's how I view it. And here's just a little bit of trivia for you. They know Carrie was born here in Kansas on the Little House on the Prairie site. And she later went on to marry a man named David Swansea. That's how I'm pronouncing it. And he was one of the workers who worked on Mount Rushmore. He helped carve Mount Rushmore. And he had been a gold prospector, and actually I think he's the one that named Mount Rushmore Mount Rushmore. And so that's just an interesting connection to the Ingalls family and to Carrie, who was born here in Kansas. Are we ready to go adventuring?
Yes.
Well, we made it to the Little House on the Prairie Museum. It's in the middle of nowhere. And this would be where the Ingalls family lived during their short time in Kansas. So we're going to take a look around. It's about 12 miles from Independence, Kansas. And this well right behind me was actually dug by Charles Ingalls, Laura Ingalls' father. The cabin is no longer here, but they're 99% sure this is the well that he dug and that this is the land where they settled. Now, the things that I was told by the museum curator, whatever her title is that the Ingalls were only here for about a year. And basically they were squatting here because this was an Osage reservation. And they thought it was going to be opened up for settlement, and so they had come down early, and they were basically squatting here waiting for the government to open it to white settlement. Well, it didn't open, and the government was actually going to send in the black buffalo soldiers to remove all the white settlers. And so they left about 3 days before the soldiers arrived because they didn't want to be forcibly removed. And then about 6 months after that, they did open up for settlement. But they left here and went back up to Wisconsin. Another reason they went back to Wisconsin was because the people they had sold their farm to up there were not able to make the payments, and so the deed reverted back to them. So they left the Kansas area and went back to Wisconsin from here. So it cost $5 for adults and $3 for children. The Ingalls family arrived here in 1869 on the Osage Diminished Reserve, believing the land would soon be available for legal purchase. They had previously lived near present-day Rothville in Yellow Creek Township. After over a year in Kansas, they returned to their home in Wisconsin. You want me to read this to you? Okay, it says barn. Bert Horton purchased this property in 1923, 12 years before Laura Ingalls Wilder published her classic Little House on the Prairie. The barn was needed to store hay bales that fed livestock through the winter. Bert built 7 barns through the years, always putting his signature cupola and weather vane, a horse, on top. After restoration, we dedicated it to Bert's great-grandson, Scott Eric Kurtis, who passed away in 2009. Scott is the son of current owner, journalist Bill Kurtis. And do you see these paintings like up on the barn there? You see those paintings? They call those barn quilts. That pattern hanging on the barn is the same pattern Laura used for her hope chest, called Doves in the Window. After Almanzo finished building their first home, he and Laura got married. He surprised her by bringing her hope chest. He also put her quilt on their bed, which was waiting for her when he brought her home for the first time after their wedding. And you see that metal up on the top of the barn up there? That's called a cupola. Well, I don't know if it's, I don't know. That's a good question to ask. See, there are some books that Nana liked to read when she was a little girl. They were all written by this lady. Her name was called Laura Ingalls Wilder. And she wrote several books about growing up when she was little. And she had a sister named Mary, and her sister Mary went blind. But before she went blind, she was able to make a quilt too. And that would have been like this on the barn over here. You see that painting on the barn? That's a 9-patch barn quilt. It says, hand dug well, the water was clear and cold and good. Laura thought she'd never tasted anything so good as those long cold drinks of water. Pa built a solid platform over the well and a heavy cover for the hole that let the water bucket through. Pa must have dug this well in 1869. It's 20 feet deep and rimmed with rock. It provides researchers with an anchor to determine the location of the original cabin. There's no great loss without some small gain. So this well was actually built by Laura Ingalls Wilder's dad. So she would have got water out of this well. She would have seen those rocks. Isn't that cool? It says, a good laugh overcomes more difficulties and dissipates more dark clouds than any other one thing. All right, so the Ingalls family, they were always traveling around. Look at all these places they went. Charles Ingalls and his wife Caroline came to the Kansas Prairie with their daughters Mary and Laura. They lived in a 1-room log cabin from 1869 to 1871. Baby Carrie was born in the cabin in 1870. The Ingalls came to Kansas for land and a promise of hope to raise their family. Pa always wanted a little house on the prairie. Charles built a log cabin similar to our replica standing today. He built a barn and dug a well, which is behind the farmhouse. They had a garden and game and birds were plentiful. It was a perfect location. Pa went to Independence for odd jobs and to bring back supplies. Laura said that Independence was 40 miles from the cabin. In reality, Independence is only 12. It only seemed like 40 miles when you were riding in a wagon and fording the creeks, kind of like how you complained about how far it was here. It was a perfect location here, except that it was on the edge of the Osage Diminished Reserve, and who owned the land was in question. In the book, Laura writes about pioneer life on the prairie and the tension and fear associated with the land dispute between Congress and the Osage tribe. Eventually, the Ingalls left their little house on the prairie and returned to their old homestead near Pepin, Wisconsin. They left the rope latch outside of the door so the next settler could use the cabin. It is the sweet, simple things of life which are the real ones after all. Look at this log cabin. I'm going to read this sign to you, okay? It says, this log cabin resembles one described as the Ingalls home in the Little House on the Prairie. The Osage signed the treaty selling the land to the government on September 10th, 1870. The family home was listed as the 89th residence of Rutland Township in the 1870 U.S. Census, and the family lived here about 1 year. In her book, Laura told of building the cabin, of encounters with Indians, of going to Independence for supplies, and of Dr. Tan's treating the family members for fever and ague. Dr. Tan's grave is in Mount Hope Cemetery in Independence. So the girl who wrote the books, this isn't the cabin that she lived in, but it's a cabin like she would have lived in. I think they rebuilt a cabin so people could see what the cabin would look like. You want to see inside? This is how people used to live. Can you believe it? Mm-hmm. And they would have lived in really tiny houses like this. You know why? Yeah. Because it would be easier to heat a very small space. So like the mom and dad probably would have slept in that bed, and the little kids would have had to sleep on a bed like this. But there's a log. Yeah, and then they have this log up here, that's their lantern. Because back then they didn't have electricity, you know. And when they went somewhere, they didn't have cars. And so they had to travel in a wagon pulled by horses. And they would have traveled here in a wagon probably very similar to this. There's another picture of the cabin. This says U.S. Post Office, Wayside, Kansas. You want me to read you the sign? The historic Wayside, Kansas Post Office was moved to this site in 1978 after it was officially closed by the United States Postmaster in 1977. The original location was less than a mile from here in the town of Wayside. The postal history of Wayside dates back to 1887, when the growing town was established due to the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad. The first mail service was delivered to the post office by horseback or wagon from Independence. The original names of the Wayside citizens are still visible on the post office boxes. These same family names now reside at Harrisonville Cemetery, located a half-mile east of the museum. The real things haven't changed. It's still best to be honest and truthful, to make the most of what we have, to be happy with the simple pleasures, and to have courage when things go wrong. I love documenting old schoolhouses because there's hardly any of them left. And it used to be almost everyone went to a one-room schoolhouse in Kansas. And my mom went to a one-room schoolhouse until I think she was in about the 2nd grade. You told me earlier you were glad the teacher wasn't here. Look at some of these students. See, this is what they would have looked like when they were going to school in this schoolhouse. See how they dressed back then? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hey, it's the cabin that we saw.
Yeah, it's just like the wagon we saw outside, correct. And you might get called up to write on the blackboard and do your lessons on the blackboard.
Well, that sounds fun.
That does sound kind of fun.
Now we're here, and then we'll go.
Oh, so you're doing the whole. You're doing the whole
tour.
We're
doing the ones that were in the books.
Okay.
You know, like Burr Oak, Iowa wasn't in the book, or Spring Valley, Minnesota, or Florida.
They were in Florida?
Just for a year. Yeah, after they were married, after Almanzo and Laura were married, they had gotten diphtheria, and she recovered, but he never fully recovered, and they thought, oh, maybe the warmer weather would be good for us. They were down there a year, and she hated the humidity.
Oh, really? I never knew they were in Florida.
Yeah.
Now, I've been to their homestead down there in southern Missouri.
That's where we're headed next. Mansfield?
Mansfield, yes. And they have Pa's violin there. I remember
That's
that.
So neat.
And that's where they spent, I think, most of their married life, and where their daughter grew up and went to high school. Mm-hmm. And there's a house, I think, in Topeka where the daughter visited. In the Potwin area, because she was pretty famous in her own right.
She was, yeah.
In her
I've got one of her
time.
books at home, yeah.
But I guess a lot, she wrote a book about one of the presidents. I can't remember which one. It might have been Hoover. And I guess it's just full of lies. I guess she was not known for being extremely truthful. She stretched the truth a lot from what I've read about her. And so I don't know, you probably know more about it than me. I know there's always a lot of controversy who actually wrote the books. I think they think she did a lot of heavy editing or...
I know that her daughter did help her edit it, and she was the one that really encouraged her to write them.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because the TV series, they called it Little House on the Prairie, but they called the town Walnut Grove,
right.
So that it's kind of, you know...
Yeah, I don't know why they did that, but...
This is the Prairie store, and I think that's a statue of what they were trying to make of the girl who lived here when she was little. So let's go on inside.
So the whole Nellie Olson thing is made up because she didn't want to hurt anybody's feelings.
Okay, so it's kind of 3 different people combined into one character?
Correct. Same with Mr. Edwards. He's what I call combination characters because the same Mr. Edwards here was not the same Mr. Edwards later on. He's the friendly neighbor.
Oh, gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder how much of the books that... I mean, I know there's a little bit of a controversy over how much she wrote and how much her daughter...
Well, Rose was an editor.
Yeah.
And actually, Laura in 1915 went to San Francisco where Rose lived. And Rose taught her some writing styles and different ways to express herself. And they kind of... Actually, Rose stole from her and she stole from Rose.
This axe was found on Edmund Mason's property. It was most likely used to help build the original cabin that the Ingalls lived in. Oh, that's so cool. Let me see what you're getting. What's it say? Sheriff. Ooh, that's a big responsibility. Can you handle it? So this house was built in about 1880, which was, 10 years... Yeah, about 10 years after the Ingalls had left. And the cabin likely stood in approximately the same place where the house was. And they know that because of that well back there that they know that Charles Ingalls built. So where this house stands is probably where the original cabin was. So this is where the house that was built around 1880 stands now. And where they think the cabin would have been somewhere in the same vicinity because it would have been close to the hand-dug well. And this is what the landscape would have looked like for the little house on the prairie. Of course, they wouldn't have had a barn like this. These were all later additions. But it is kind of interesting to think that Laura Ingalls Wilder, as a child, actually played in this yard. In this area. Of course, it would have not been mown, it would have been natural. But Laura Ingalls Wilder, this would have been her view as a child. When she went outside, when her mom told her to go feed the chickens or go outside and play, go get some water out of the well, whatever she was, just get out of the house because you're getting on my nerves, kid. This is what her view would have been when she was about 3 or 4 years old. The Kurtis family, this land has been in their family a long time. Charles Kurtis, of course, is a very famous news broadcaster. He's very famous in the Topeka area because he was reporting on the tornado, the 1966 tornado, the F5 that took out a lot of Topeka. He was the one reporting, saying, "Take cover now." And his family did not find out that the land that they owned had belonged, its historical significance, that the Ingalls had lived on this land until 1969. And I think this land's been in their family, since like the 20s or something. But it's an interesting little tour, and the lady inside the building, she knows a lot of history about the family and about the area. So highly recommend you visit it. And if you're a big fan of the books, if like me, you grew up reading the books as a little girl, it's just really interesting to see what the land around where the cabin would have been actually looked like. I really doubt the prairie has changed much since Laura Ingalls Wilder was a child here. And this is the museum. And And where that house sits is probably very close to where the original cabin sat. And this would have been your view outside the cabin. So just imagine the Ingalls family sitting outside at night, listening to the birds and enjoying this view, because this is what they would have been looking at. Here's another view. This would have been, this is west. And maybe if they were, we don't know which direction the cabin faced. So the cabin may have faced this direction. It's the prettier view. But regardless, it would have looked something like this back in 1869, because not a whole lot has changed since then. Other than, of course, they built a big highway over there. Pretty out here. It's just gorgeous. Thank you so much for watching my video. I hope you enjoyed our trip to the Little House on the Prairie Museum. I highly recommend it. If you got anything out of the video, give me a like, a comment, a share, or subscribe. We go to all kinds of fun places, and you're welcome to join us.